you want to be mindful of the cost, but it's immaterial if one cost me $5 and one cost me $1, but one gave me, an outcome of $100 versus 50, but the $50 one cost me less. Who cares? I'd rather have the $100 every time. And that's not exactly, an apples to apples comparison, but this idea of getting so caught up with cost is not helpful to you. What we need to be focused is on outcome.
Welcome to One with the Other Way, a podcast about your journey in finances. I'm your host, James. We have Wanda and Peggy with us today, and we're talking about exchange traded funds versus mutual funds, kind of what's the difference, kind of comparing, contrasting, why ETFs are such a hot topic discussion right now. We've already have a podcast on mutual funds, and I will have that linked in the description. So if you want to learn more, go watch that before you watch this.
So let's talk about ETFs. ETFs were created back in the 90s. Interestingly enough, technology allowed us to create ETFs. And a nod to our Canadian partners in the North, actually, the first ETF was created in Canada, which I think is fascinating, that they beat us to the punch. What? We came in maybe a few years later, about that time, and we started with our SPDR. State Street decided the SPDR ETF, and that's the first one, and that's actually the biggest one at $500 billion.
Well, tell me, okay, the name exchange traded fund, what even is it, and how did it get its name? What does it mean?
Yeah, exchange traded funds. So what happened is a person thought to themselves, there's a way that I can discreetly bundle a bunch of stocks and call it one ETF unit. We actually call this an ETF creation unit. And they can bundle the stocks. And so the security exchange is like, okay, if you request, you can create your own ETF. And this was done primarily with a focus on indexes. So the S&P 500 index has 500 stocks, and we can discreetly have a fractional share of each of the stocks based on their exposure in that S&P 500. And then that traded unit, right? So once they file with the security exchange, they create the ETF, and then that unit can be sold to the investor. So then that investor now has this creation unit, this ETF creation unit, with a bundle of the 500 stocks that make up the S&P 500 in the case of the SPY ETF. And so he or she trades on their stock, their portfolio. And when a trade is made, it's made against his stock, his portfolio. So he had 0.1 Apple share, then he realized 0.1 Apple share when he sold his discrete creation unit of the ETF, or his share of the ETF. So that allows for more tax efficiency because it only affects that investor. That investor bought that creation unit that had those 500 stocks at that point in time. It can now be sold as a stock at any time during the day against his portfolio.
As opposed to a mutual fund, which a fund manager would, make a change in the allocation of what stocks are in that full portfolio, and it would affect all investors.
Yes, and a mutual fund manager must balance his books at the end of the day based on inflows and outflows. And if he has more outflows, he has to look at his portfolio and decide, oh, I need to sell some positions. Which positions should I sell? And he must reach into the portfolio and sell it. And all investors in the mutual fund experience the capital gain associated with the sale of whatever position he sold to take care of the liquidations.
Right. But don't forget that also ETF fund managers, they do have fund managers as well, James, and they also do make changes to the portfolio.
Okay.
As a whole, not just individually. So what you said is correct. And ETFs also have fund managers that do also make changes to the portfolio, which could result in capital gains taxes. So I think the major difference is you talked about the creation of them when they started, and I think that was more, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about cost too, because originally they were set up to start tracking indexes and make the costs smaller. But now ETFs have evolved, and they are not just for index funds. They have fund managers. They have lots of different types of ETFs.
I'm going to even provide maybe a little bit more clarity. It was also for transparency. If I have a discrete ETF creation unit that has the 500 stocks represented proportionally, I personally know that I sold this on this day, and this was this portion, this portion, this portion to all of the 500 stocks. So it's a transparency thing. If a fund manager has an inflow and an outflow, and then he must go in and sell some positions, he's going to maybe say, well, I'm going to sell Google. But you don't have transparency to know how he balanced his books at the end of his day. So if I have an ETF, I know exactly that S&P 500 index in those proportional stocks was represented in that ETF. I'm going to also go on to say, though, initially, right, because of technology, it was limited to indexes. We had to do indexes. Yet now, initially, the first iteration was to move into thematic ETFs, where you're saying, well, I'm just going to do healthcare, only the healthcare stocks in the healthcare index. And yet now you have fund managers that can take a mutual fund and make it an ETF, because he can say, he or she can say in his portfolio, or the team can say, my ETF will consist of this, this, and this. Right. And I'm making active choices as an active manager. And again, this is allowing for transparency and lower taxes to the investor, which is really cool. So you're starting to see like a mutual fund, like recently this week, AKRE Focus is changing from a mutual fund into an ETF, again, because technology allows that fund manager to create the creation units and to move forward with that, which is cool.
Next question to those that are interested. If mutual funds themselves are converting themselves to ETFs, what's the point of still having mutual funds?
Because you want, in general, actively managed funds, and there's a whole thing that we can talk about actively managed funds. There's an expense associated with going to security exchange, filing the paperwork, creating the unit, and then selling it into the market. And so there's a front-end load expense associated with that. Not all mutual funds are ready to go through that. But the shift will be that way because we are moving to try to lower costs across the board. I mean, we want value for investors. And if we can get better value tax-wise, transparency-wise, cost-wise, we're going to move that direction. So I think it's just a matter of time before there will no longer be mutual funds. It'll be like one of those things that will be in our historical, do you remember when? I think it's going to be a time that all of us will be in the ETF world only, but not yet.
Right. That's going to be in the future. And so how does this affect your average investor, right? Like I'm talking to my financial advisor and they're saying, we're going to do this ETF and we're going to do this mutual fund. And okay, so now I understand a little bit more. What does that mean? Right. Well, kind of, even though, I understand it, but I'm just saying as a typical investor, I think the major thing to understand too about the two ETF versus mutual fund is how they're traded, right? So exchange traded fund. That means it's traded on the exchange during the day, the same as a stock, right? You buy it at market price, you sell it at market price, right? A mutual fund. You buy and you sell it, but the trades don't happen until the close of the day, and it happens on their NAV. And the net asset value is determined at the end of the day each day, right? So there's a little bit, of a difference there. Okay, so now I'm your average investor, and my financial advisors putting me into ETFs and putting me into mutual funds. And should I, as the investor, be saying, oh, I don't know that I want that mutual fund because it's going to cost me 0.0005. And that over there is going to cost me, a little bit less. I'm just saying, what is it that as a standard investor, if I'm sitting down with you, Wanda, and you're telling me which things that you're recommending,
right.
Should I be asking more questions about that or not? Is this something that the average investor needs to be really paying attention to? And if so, why?
Yeah. So you get a lot of questions about cost, and you do want to minimize cost, but you always want to have value. So when you go to the store, right, and you buy a cheap pair of shoes, right, they generally don't last you as long as a higher quality shoe. And so, I take 2 running shoes, right? And one that I get, the Atonic over at the Big Five that I paid like $20 for isn't going to get me the mileage that the Mizuno over here running shoe designed for running. So what you want to look at is the outcome, right? What does that investment give you in terms of your big financial picture? How does that affect? You want to be mindful of the cost, but it's immaterial if one cost me $5 and one cost me $1, but one gave me, an outcome of $100 versus $50, but the $50 one cost me less. Who cares? I'd rather have the $100 every time. And that's not exactly, an apples to apples comparison, but this idea of getting so caught up with cost is not helpful to you. What we need to be focused is on outcome. You want to have your best life. Your best life needs finances to support it. So we want your financial picture to be as the best that it can be for you.
Right.
And that's what we need to be focused on, outcome.
Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast on ETFs and how they're different from mutual funds. If you want to talk to an advisor, you can meet us at financesforreallife.com. You can use the schedule the appointment button on the top right of the page to talk to either Wanda or Peggy. And you can continue following this podcast every 2 weeks. We post on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision.